Would you rather own one property or four? Most people think more properties equals more money, but here's the truth. One commercial property deal at a 7% yield can outperform 4 residential properties with the same yield. And today we're going to analyze 2 different scenarios. One commercial property versus 4 residential properties. Both have the same $2 million value, but completely different outcomes. And by the end of this video, you're going to see how the type of property matters more than the quantity of properties. So now let's get into analyzing 2 different scenarios. One is a 7% yield in commercial and one is 4 properties in residential. So the 2 properties have the same value, a $2 million commercial and 4 $500,000 residential properties. Now the difference between commercial and residential is they have what's called a gross yield and a net yield. So commercial net yield is when the rent you get after all your expenses, you divide it by the purchase price. So in commercial property, the tenant pays for most of the expenses and all the outgoings like the water repairs and property management, things like that. Whereas the residential here, you have a gross yield. So that's the rent before all your expenses divided by the purchase price. And so in residential property, the investor has a lot more actual upfront cost that the tenant doesn't pay for. Whereas in commercial property, the tenant pays for a lot of the expenses. So we're going to look at analyzing these 2 different scenarios. So in residential, the investor has to pay the loan, property management, vacancy, council rates, water, land tax, insurance, repairs, body corporate, fit outs, utilities. All those costs are associated and have to be paid by the investor. Whereas in commercial property, all that's paid by the investor is the loan, the property management, and vacancy. So all these other things that are associated with actually owning a property are paid by the tenant in commercial property. So that's why your actual rent can be a lot higher in commercial property. So you could still have $2 million worth of assets in terms of residential and $2 million worth of assets in commercial, but the commercial is going to be generating way more income because you're not having to pay all these things. The tenant is actually paying them in commercial. Whereas in residential, the investor has to pay for all of these things. So we're going to look at 2 different scenarios, both $2 million worth of assets, but 4 properties in residential and 1 commercial. So the purchase price, I found an actual commercial property, purchase price of $2 million and $90,000. The rent is $134,000. So that's a net yield of 6.44%, and the expenses are paid by the tenant. So the net yield is basically all of that. You're not paying for all the other things that on this list, the tenant's paying for them. And I found an example $500,000 property, and we're just going to times by 4 to get the $2 million worth of value. So on the $500,000 property, the rent is $27,000. That's a 6% gross yield, similar to the same yield in terms of the commercial, but the expenses are $5,000. So you end up with a net yield of 4.5%, which is way lower than the net yield over here in commercial. And if you times it by 4, you've got the rent of $110,000, same yield, expenses $20,000 now. So you're left over with $90,000 in rent, whereas this one's got $134,000 in rent. And if you look at the cash flow snapshot on this property, $2,090,000, 30% deposit, same net income, 6% interest rate, you're left with $46,000 a year in cash flow from this one property, this one commercial deal. And if we look at the cash flow snapshot, it's not until we get to 10% interest rates that this property start to become negatively geared. So even if the interest rates go up to 10% or up to 9%, you're still going to positively geared $2,000 from this one property. Whereas if they go down to 3%, you're going to be positively geared $90,000 just from this $2 million commercial property. And if you look at the 4 residentials, same $2 million purchase price, we're going to use a 20% deposit. We're using that 4.5% net yield. So your net income is going to be $90,000 a year. And 6% interest rates, the cash flow is going to be negative $6,000 a year. So we can see the difference between these 2 properties. This one's positively geared $46,000. This one's negatively geared $6,000. What's that? A $52,000 difference between these 2 scenarios. And in the cash flow snapshot, it's positively geared at 5% interest rates, but not 6%. And if you go down to 3% interest rates, it's going to be positive cash flow 42,000. So there's a huge, not too big of it. So there's a huge difference between the cash flow actual buffer in place between these two properties. Whereas this one, it's not negative until 10% interest rates. This one's negative at 6%. So look at a cash flow comparison. This commercial property, $2 million valuation, is positively geared $46,000 a year. This residential property is negatively geared $6,000. So you've got 4 properties, negatively geared $6,000. That's not too bad. But let's look at a 15-year timeline. We've got the 2 different scenarios. So this one is the residential and this one's the commercial. We've got this 20% deposit on the residential, same yield. We're going to use a 4% rental increase each year, and we're going to stick with a 6% interest rate. And so by year 1, you're going to be negatively geared $6,000. By year 3 is when you start to become positively geared, and it's $800 a year, which isn't a lot. But by year 10, you're positively geared $37,000 from this one property, for these 4 properties, sorry. And by year 15, you're positively geared $81,000 with these 4 properties, but you've still got a $1.1 million debt on the $2 million worth of property. And that's because you're going interest only. And for the commercial property, same purchase price, we're going to use a 30% deposit, so you need a bit more cash up front. Same yield, same 4% rental increase, and the same 6% interest rate. No extra payments. We're going to use the cash flow to pay down the debt. Year 1, you're positively geared $46,000. By year 5, $83,000. So this one is positively geared $81,000 after year 15. This one's already making more money after year 5 in terms of positive cash flow. By year 12, the property is completely paid off, and it's generating you over $200,000 a year in passive income. So that's a huge difference. This property is completely paid off and debt-free in 12 years. This one in 12 years still has, $1.3 million worth of debt attached to the 4 properties. So that's a big difference in how much debt there is and how much cash flow you can generate from these 2 different types of scenarios. But if we look at, capital growth as well, there's not just paying down the debt, there's also the capital growth associated with the properties. And what sort of difference is there over the 15-year timeline in capital growth? So for the residential properties, I used a 7% capital growth. For the commercial, I used 6%. So in year 1, that $2 million has grown $140,000 in terms of capital growth in the residential. By year 10, it's grown to almost $4 million. So it's almost doubled in 10 years just from the capital growth. And by year 15, the capital growth has been over $3.5 million just from these 4 properties. So there's a huge amount of capital growth just by holding on to them. And by year 15, it's also positively geared $81,000. Now for commercial property, the capital growth isn't as much. As you can see, by year 15, it's only $5 million compared to $5.5 million. But this one is completely debt-free. So the $5.5 million is debt-free, and it's generating you $250,000 worth of passive income. So it's pretty good. For the 10-year cash flow comparison, so what I did is I basically totaled up all the positive cash flow from the residential and all the positive cash flow from the commercial. And so the residential equals $130,000 over the 15 years. Commercial, almost $1 million over those 15 years. But in capital growth, the residential outperformed the commercial, so you ended up with $3.5 million worth of capital growth, whereas in the commercial only $2.9 million. So that if you calculate the total, the commercial property generated $3.8 million worth of actual income in terms of capital growth and the cash flow, whereas the residential 3.7. So you're better off, about $150,000 over 15 years. But you got to take into account, do you want to be, focused on capital growth, or do you want to focus on cash flow? Because I feel like cash flow can allow you to generate a bit of a buffer over those 15 years. So if tenants goes or leaves, you've got, a buffer savings in place to pay off the debt and maintain, owning the property over those 15 years, because a lot can happen. So I feel like you're a bit more comfortable generating $1 million worth of income compared to $100,000 worth of income. despite the difference in capital growth. But, you know, it's up to you to decide. So more property doesn't always equal more profit. The right yield on the right asset can do more for your freedom in a portfolio than looking impressive based on the number of properties you own. So a commercial on a 7% yield versus 4% gross yield, the numbers speak for themselves. Would you rather have, you know, $130,000 of positive cash flow over 10 years, or would you rather have, you know, $1 million worth of cash flow? You know, I think the $1 million speaks for itself. So I thought this was an interesting scenario just to compare, you know, different same property value, just different assets. You got the commercial asset or the residential asset, and see which one actually performs better. Obviously at the start, it's going to be easy to hold on to the commercial asset because it's positive geared already. Whereas the residential asset is actually negatively geared. But over the long term, there's not too much of a difference. 150 grand over 10, 15 years, not a huge difference. So it's up to you to decide which sort of asset or route you want to go down to. But I hope this informed you. It helped me kind of figure out which sort of asset class I want to get into. Hope it does the same for you. Now, if you like this sort of video, go watch my last video where I show you how a commercial property deal can be completely debt-free and paid off by itself in 10 years. So go watch that next and subscribe so you don't miss out.